What is happening, guys? It's Halsey Schider with the Helicopter Podcast, and I am bombarding my guest, David Dziura, right now. He was like fumbling through some notes. You know, I've known Dave for a long time. He's just a stand-up guy, and he wants to do a good job. And I'm like, dude, no notes. I'm just press and go. So here we are.
Fumbling's maybe an exaggeration.
He was fumbling. He looked like he was fumbling to me.
Yeah.
That's just my perception. But welcome to the Helicopter Podcast. I'm your guy, Halsey. Big shout out to MHM Publishing and the whole entire Vertical HeliCASTS family. And of course, to our sponsors. We couldn't do it without you. This is 2 of 2. So I've had a repeat guest now once before, Forrest Crouppen, and now I'm having my second repeat. And actually, I think I'll have Dave on maybe at least once, twice, 3 times a year, if not more, because Dave is not only a longtime friend, but he's kind of dedicated to helicopter safety. He's part of the helicopter safety team, something like that. He can correct me if I'm wrong. Again, we're just shooting from the hip here, Dave. So Dave is a great resource. He's also a DPE, so we're going to talk about some of that stuff today. He was texting me some things that I wasn't even aware of that we're going to talk about today. So I think this should be a pretty good episode. Dave, what's up, buddy? Welcome back. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm flattered to be a repeat. Maybe I'll be like, was it one of the Saturday Night Live records for multiple showings. I get a robe eventually. I can wear a robe on your
the hosting 5 times robe.
Yeah, like Steve Martin. I'd like to wear a robe on your, especially now that it's video.
We should. Yeah, last time you were on it, we were audio only. I didn't have the studio. You know, we've come a long way, Dave, since we last talked.
It's exciting.
We have sponsors now. We have a platform with MHM, which is pretty cool. So yeah, it's all good. We're happy to have you back on, and I do mean it. All joking aside, I think that you are someone that is really committed to the industry. When I think of someone that is all about the helicopter industry and making the industry a better place and trying to just kind of do your part of that, I think of you. I think that you're really passionate about safety, and you're not a guy that just talks about safety, but you institute it within your flying, into your check rides. And so I think, conversations with you are important. So what's on the agenda today, Dave? What are we talking about? You're the host.
Well, this past 6 months, there's been a lot of new developments in safety and in training and testing. So I figured we could talk about a few of those things. Some of your listeners are probably familiar with a chunk of it, but maybe not all of it. And hopefully we have something that touches a lot of different operations or pilots or CFIs out there. And we'll just try to, it's so much, I'm sure we can't go into everything, but I figured it'd be good to touch on a few things, and then I'll try to bring it down from the changes, whether it be regulatory or otherwise, down into people's operations.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I'm happy to talk about it. One thing, looking at my notes here that I wasn't aware of, but I kind of just want to start right in this, not necessarily safety, but it says right here that SFAR 73 is getting updated. What is that all about?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, I feel like I was late on the train to that as well. Over the last, I think at least 2 years, maybe in 2022, they were doing a review of that. A group of safety, or like a risk management review, was checking it out to see if, it needed changes, if it was relevant still after a long time in service, or I guess in publication. And so, they did make some changes. And now I think the biggest thing that I see, really, because the changes are not that dramatic, but they went into effect actually yesterday. So they are live, which,
wow.
yeah, I don't know how.
hot off the press.
Hot off the press, yeah.
I am embarrassed. This just shows that I am somewhat disconnected sometimes. So I'm glad that we're talking about it. Real fast though, Dave, before we go too deep, for our listeners that maybe are like, what is SFAR 73? Just a quick background. SFAR 73 is a special federal aviation regulation, SFAR, and it pertains to R22s and R44 helicopters. And essentially, if you fly the R22 or you fly the R44, you've heard of the SFAR. In fact, you've probably heard about it a lot. You've talked about it a lot. And essentially, it's a series of kind of more strict regulatory requirements to operate on the controls of an R22 or an R44. It has things like awareness training that you have to do. It has aeronautical experience requirements that don't really apply to other helicopters. It has flight review requirements, and it also has requirements to operate as PIC and or to operate as a CFI, hourly requirements, again, that don't exist in other helicopter platforms outside of Robinson. So that's what we're talking about. And I think it came in like what? It's been like since 1995 or something.
I think
that it's
4
been,
maybe. Yep. Just
so
about.
94, 95. I was actually at the safety course recently and they talked about the SFAR. They didn't talk about changes coming up. So
yeah, I felt a little bit in the dark too when I found out that this was all going on. Ultimately, looking at the list of people who was on the risk management analysis, obviously Tim Tucker and Robinson people were on. They also had VAI or HAI staff, and then FAA representatives, and a lot of people looking at it. And there was you can go check out the actual kind of output from this committee or group that looked at everything, and all the data that they analyzed, which could be interesting. They break down all the low G or mass bumping events, and how many per aircraft are, which make or which model, and they looked at all that to determine changes. So ultimately, to me, the changes, as we're building this up, but they're not that big. The good thing is that they're not going to retroactively get rid of anybody's endorsements or anything that people are already qualified. They're all covered. So nothing huge there. But they did put an expiration date on for 5 years from now, basically, where it would either expire unless revised. And I know the intention is to look at this again and continue to reevaluate. And the process, I think, is now underway for maybe other revisions in the future. And so I think that's all positive. The main stuff that came out in this revision was kind of a lot of updates that were appropriate given some of the changes that happened around the SFAR, like low G and mass bumping training, or mass bump training not being allowed to, or low G recovery, we should say, not being allowed to ever being done, but being in the flight training. They removed that altogether from flight training, but it's still in the ground pressure portion. So
where you talk about it,
that'll make sense. But then the major one is like defining what enhanced training and auto rotation procedures, which was one of the items that everybody has to do during PIC training or otherwise. But what is enhanced?
Right?
There's been debate over that for years.
Yeah, I mean, what is an enhanced auto rotation? It's interesting because the SFAR 73, when you talk to Robinson, they don't love it, obviously. And it's very old. I mean, look, if it was, say, we'll call it 1994 or 95, somewhere in that early 90s time period. I mean, we're going on, 30 years of this SFAR being imposed, right? I was 6 years old, I guess, when this all started coming out. And so it seems like at that time, the R22 specifically was the only aircraft that Robinson had. Completely revolutionary to the industry, right? I mean, lightweight, underslung, low inertia. So lots of things to cause an accident, right? And kind of an unfamiliar aircraft. But it's been so long. I wonder really just the relevance of SFAR.
That's one of the things they analyze and they acknowledge is that things like low G and recovery, and low RPM and blade stall, all these things are now well documented and published in the other FAA training resources in a way that they weren't so much before. And so, yeah, they questioned that, or I guess it was evaluated. But in the end, they did an analysis that, for those who aren't familiar with like organized risk analyses, you've got a matrix, and this applies to everything from, it could be in your operation. And they did the same thing for the rules. So they said, okay, what's the probability of an issue, and what's the consequences? Is it catastrophic or is it minor? And so ultimately, a lot of these things fell in the middle, because they said, okay, things like low G and mass bumping events actually have been statistically like extremely improbable recently due to the training and mitigations and other things and the numbers are reflected in the accents, but the consequence is so catastrophic that they said this falls under medium and we're going to stick with the status quo. And so from that standpoint, you can kind of understand how they came to these conclusions. But I think it's great that the debate's going to, or I don't know, that the analysis is going to continue, because there's always a lot of changes. One of the biggest things I think about when I think about the SFAR is the 200-hour requirement, which I think is great for instructors. That's to instruct in a Robinson aircraft, but it has major unintended consequences on simulator use. Is that ultimately every hour you fly in a simulator has to be replicated in the aircraft if you want to instruct it eventually. And simulators are getting so much better all the time, even for small aircraft like R22. They just finally, in the past 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, officially certified the first VR simulator in the United States.
Love that.
Which is Loft Dynamics, if you're not familiar. It's a 125 simulator, but same company offers an R22 simulator. And so hoping to see great things there. The point, though, is that, I think they're always going to be underutilized in training, primarily from a cost standpoint and motivation from students until it changes that they don't need to log that time in the aircraft. And I think maybe I'm not against the 200-hour rule per se, but I wonder if there's ways to strike a better balance where simulators play a bigger role, because there's so much you could do in there you can't do in the aircraft.
Well, especially like the simulation now. I mean, you and I, when we went to Hillsborough together, that to me, no offense to Hillsborough, but that wasn't like a great simulator, right? It was great for IFR procedure, in my opinion,
right?
And doing procedural stuff like that. But I got the opportunity to do the VR. It was in a Leonardo product, the Leonardo VR. I think I flew a 119 or something. And man, that's incredible. I mean, it feels like you're flying.
It really puts you in the seat.
You're touching buttons. You're feeling things. I mean, that was.
You can see your hands, right? It's pretty.
You
impressive.
can see your hands, and they're still not cheap, right? I mean, I think that one was around $1 million or something like that. But compared to like the full motion, I forget the levels. I'm not a simulator guy, but full motion, legitimate simulator. I mean, those are like millions and millions of dollars. So I see that price point is going to continue to go down because the technology is just caught up. And I think at some point we will have R22 and R44 simulators that are VR that are extremely realistic, right? And I think it's going to be a very affordable option for a lot of flight schools to incorporate that type of simulation.
Yeah, and I think, I see the results from they're incredibly effective trainers, but they're getting, because the realism, like you said, they're getting great at training just VFR normal maneuvers and flying, and that's the big difference from the past.
That's crazy.
But from a safety standpoint, their value is unequivocal, or wow, maybe they're not the right word, but in any case, undeniable is probably a better term. And
sure.
Yeah, we're looking at, I think, that's kind of my personal opinion about one of the SFAR items, but long term, we'll see how they analyze, like we said, all those different factors. I know that there was also debate, but it didn't come out with the change on whether you really need a separate flight review for an R22 and R44. So that came up in the analysis, but it did turn out and it changed this time. We'll see eventually down the road. But anybody who's training or flying these aircraft, go check out the changes. The main enhanced auto rotation definition they came out with includes things like maximum distance glide configuration or minimum rate of descent glide configuration, and then maneuvering in order to prevent undershooting or overshooting a spot. So nothing crazy, but things that are specifically in there that you're going to want to hit if you're training people in those aircraft and giving endorsements.
Yeah, no, it's awesome, and I think it's good to have that definition, because we always used to joke about that, like what is an advanced auto, and at Hillsborough we always took it as max rate, best glide, making it to your spot, things like that. I mean, so I think we all kind of incorporated what they're talking about, but it's not so ambiguous, right? And it's kind of funny for like for legalese, right? Gray area, ambiguity. I can't say the word ambiguity.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily make sense. So it's funny that it's taken that long. And, Robinson's done a lot of things too, right? We had David Smith on the podcast a couple of times. The first time we had David on was to talk about the new horizontal stabilizer. That stabilizer's, in testing, both, in-flight testing and simulation, dramatically decreases the roll, caused by actually not the tail rotor thrusts. We've been lied to.
Yeah, that was an exciting discovery and development.
Yeah, where they saw in the Hueys and things where it's mounted higher up that was actually causing an intense roll. And so now with this new horizontal stabilizer, I think we're going to see those accidents down. The one last thing that I have on SFAR 73 question to you is that there's actually been more, I think, I don't know, this is just me hearing industry stuff, but it seems like specifically in the R66 and the autopilot, and maybe keeping the autopilot engaged during turbulent weather, that there's been accidents with low G mass bumping. Are you surprised at all that they haven't addressed the R66 within the SFAR? It's a lighter airframe than the R44. It's just as susceptible to the low G conditions that they're trying to avoid for 2244. Is it surprising that they haven't added that or talked about that at all?
Thank you to our sponsor, Vertical Aviation International. Are you ready for the largest vertical aviation show in the world? Verticon, formerly HAI Heli Expo, is coming to Dallas in March. With over 15,000 professionals and 600 companies in attendance, this is an event you don't want to miss. If you're interested in exhibiting, contact sales at verticalavi.org. That's sales at verticalavi.org. See you at Verticon.
So, yeah, I looked at that specifically in reading the analysis by the group that was reviewing SFAR 73. They talked about those specific issues, which aircraft were appropriate. They talked about, they used the terminology to say the R44 or R66 fly more like a traditional Part 27 certificated or, aircraft. And so that was kind of it seemed like one of their takeaways was that it wasn't worth putting in there. But yeah, I don't know if that, case is closed. And certainly right in the numbers, you can see actually when they break it down in the analysis that the R66, I think, I don't want to misquote it, but certainly the accidents were notable in the last decade, had more than an R44 hands down. And so,
yeah, it's interesting.
That wasn't news to me or you, and most people keep an eye on that sort of thing. And I think that's definitely a consideration. But along the same lines as the stabilizer, training, there's all sorts of mitigations. It's design, there's, training, there's, like you said, use of autopilot and other things that all come into to determine what's appropriate.
Yeah, I've always thought that's kind of fascinating. And, it makes me kind of wonder who are the people that are making these decisions to write these SFARs and make these decisions, because, just from a flying perspective, to me, there's no flying characteristically different between an R66 and an R44. I think that the R66 is a lighter R44 with a turbine engine is my analysis. That's just my feeling of what it's like to fly the aircraft. So it is kind of funny to hear that. But regardless, we don't need to talk about SFAR 73 this whole time, Dave. It's been 17 minutes and 38 seconds.
That's a long time.
That's a lot of SFAR. One of the things that people keep asking me about, so one thing about, I guess, getting a little bit of a voice in the industry is, it's great to hear from people. People ask a lot of questions. I get hit up quite a bit, which is great. Keep doing it. Heli Halsey is my new Instagram handle, so you can message me there. But people are asking a lot about this PTS versus now I think it's the ACS. And Dave, the honest truth is, pals, I'm very far out of the training world, the check ride world. It's not really my cup of tea. So I'm hoping that you can help me kind of better understand, since you're a DPE and you're kind of immersed in this world. What is the ACS compared to the predecessor that I'm familiar with, the PTS? What does it mean for students? What are some of the new requirements that are happening for check rides? I'm being told that the fold downs maybe aren't happening anymore. There's an endorsement for that. So fill me in on some of the blanks there.
But yeah, overall, it was a big, a big change in that all but just a couple documents got changed over overnight. And it was with, I think, in my opinion, kind of a somewhat short notice. But, as helicopter, we have to, I guess, well, it doesn't make it any better, but in perspective, like the airplane training and DPEs and CFIs have been using the ACS for years now. And so they all also got updated at the same time. And so I think the helicopters not always that's been my experience. The regulators, everybody else, we're quite an afterthought. So they made these updates and they were minor changes for a lot of, I wish to say the vast majority of aviation industry. But for the helicopters, it was a huge change. And I don't know that everybody was really prepared. We all knew, or if you were paying attention, you saw the rulemaking, the proposed rulemaking when it was put out quite a while ago. But you never know when that's going to turn into an actual publication of a rule. So in any case, it's here. Yeah, it went into effect on May 31st. So any training or tests at this point are all going on the ACS and the PTS instead of the PTS. There's still some that haven't been issued. So like, for example, the flight instructor instrument test, it's still on PTS. They just didn't come out with a document for that. So you got to make sure you look and you go to the FAA website and make sure you have the right document for your test without question. But most of them are ACS now. The biggest feedback I have, or like advice I have for anybody doing training as an applicant or a student or as a CFI, is just to read the entire ACS. There's really no substitute for that. I mean, it's not great reading, but
give us the quiz notes, Dave. Come on.
Yeah, everything has to be trained. Everything has to, like, the big thing on how to use it. Most people who have looked at it are probably familiar now. They broke all the tasks down instead of just a list of things to cover. You've got knowledge, you've got risk management, and you've got skills. As an examiner, I have to choose one knowledge element at least, or one risk element at least. But then all the skills have to be tested. And for, I guess, as a student or an instructor, that doesn't excuse anybody, of course, from training on all the knowledge and risk elements. And that, I think, is probably the main thing, is that those lists kind of got longer. So there's more specifics in knowledge and risk management that people need to look at and familiarize with if you want to make sure that, all the questions that are asked are trained on. And then there are new tasks. So, for example, one of the biggest changes, which has kind of big implications, is the commercial test now, or the ACS, has some instrument tasks in it. So you have to bring to a commercial test an aircraft that's capable of actually doing instrument flying. And then, it's basically, maneuvers like straight and level, climbing and descending turns, all while referenced to instruments. But there's also recovery from unusual attitudes. And this all goes back to the fact that they recognized, obviously, that a lot of accidents are caused by flight into IMC or reduced visibility, visually degraded conditions. So I think, that could change. Anybody's doing training in R22 or otherwise, you're going to have to be proficient enough, or bring an aircraft that's equipped for an instrument task to the test. And that could have an effect on a lot of people.
Yeah, we've been actually talking about that, on the helicopter side, maybe there's now potential for, we might see aircraft needing upgrade, some upgraded panels and things like that to accommodate. It's very interesting. And actually, I'm not really against that. I mean, I think as a commercial helicopter pilot, probably one of the biggest things that you could face as a commercial helicopter pilot is, degraded visibility, flying into kind of poor weather or whatnot, and potentially going inadvertent. And I think that, from my soapbox, if I may, Dave, the inadvertent IMC thing to me has always been kind of under-communicated, under-taught. When you and I were youngsters going through our training, maybe, I guess we talked about CFIT, that was something that we had to kind of know and understand. But I don't think it was, there's never, in my opinion, been a big push within the helicopter industry, because it's like, we're just so VFR. So it's always been like, just stay out of the clouds, right? But it's not that simple, because you could do everything right, including air medical companies where it's a pilot making a decision. It's an OCC making a secondary decision to make sure that that's fine. you're using your risk analysis, your matrix, you're doing everything right. And then you could still end up in the clouds because things change. Weather reporting isn't perfect. Stations are far apart, especially when you're flying in the middle of nowhere. So it's interesting to me that we haven't pushed it. Why do you think it's taking so long?
I mean, I think most people agree with you. Like as an examiner, still, this question that comes up, every test, basically I'm asking about, it's sort of an inverted IMC scenario because it's so crucial to our industry. And when I usually am asking, what are the hazards? How would you deal with it? What would you do? But yeah, a lot of times when I feedback to the CFIs has to come back to the students, unless you directly address it, they're going to come to their own conclusions and they're not going to fully understand the situation. And that's, I think, what you're saying. So you have to talk about it very explicitly. But the answer that I get that most bugs me, I guess, is people say, oh, you're going to run into a tower or you can't see other aircraft. And that's just a gross misunderstanding of the hazard at play. Like you'll be so lucky if you find a tower. That would be a really long time to be cruising in these conditions, right? Like, and that's obviously a weird way to put it, but you're going to find the ground way before you find a tower. And so you have to talk about it in very clear language, and the 56-second video is an awesome way to do that.
Totally.
But in any case, which
we talked about last time.
Yeah, it's something that I think, to your point, and since we're on topic of the ACS, generationally, we're going to start to see changes. One of the new tasks of the CFI ACS, which I'm a real fan of, is in the FOIs. There's an entirely new task, which is teaching risk management and accident prevention. And so CFIs are now, or applicants are now required to it's one of the required tasks. So there's only so many FOIs they have to do, FOI tasks, and they'll have to demonstrate their ability to talk explicitly about risk management and accident prevention in a teaching format. And it includes things like PAVE checklist and FRATs are both items in the knowledge elements for that task. So there's no way to take in a CFI test and not have, or not pass it, or no way to pass it and not have really dove into those things. And so hopefully going forward, it'll just really narrow down the number of people who come through and haven't had those conversations.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to hear that. I think it's important. And I think especially for CFI candidates, I was always pretty hard on CFI candidates going through a stage check, because to me, that's, now you're about to go and be the PIC in a situation with a new student, and you're going to go and teach the next generation. You're going to teach the people that you and I are going to be sharing the skies with. And yeah, I think that there's been areas that have been under-taught, and you see when you go to the industry, it's like, oh man, I wish I had a better grasp on this, or, I think it's kind of systemic, like, hey, we don't talk enough about inadvertent. I think it's a leading cause of, accidents. Why don't we talk about it? Kobe Bryant, inadvertent, that's a whole other ball of wax that we won't, don't have to get into, but you're right. I mean, the understanding that you would be so lucky to find a hill or a mountain, the truth is you're going to be rolling over in 7 seconds and nose diving towards the ground is the actual, if you don't first cut your mast off or your tail, if you're in an underslung, system or whatever it may be. So it's just crazy to me. That's like one of the scariest potentials for me. I've always been so conservative. So I'm glad we're talking about it. When you talk about, I guess when you're a DPE and you're assessing, say, a CFI applicant's ability to comprehend, understand, and teach this risk management, what are you looking for?
Well, I mean, it's great for me to have a standard to point to right now, where previously we kind of had to assess those things, but they weren't as well defined. And that's what the ACS is really all about, is better defining the risk management and the tasks and elements. And so ultimately, in the ACS is to use a scenario-based training, basically task to demonstrate the ability to instruct in that context about risk management and things like that. And to me, that's in pretty clear language. Like for us, but previously it could be hard to say you either did this effectively or not, because it wasn't in as clear language. So for somebody to come in and have the ability to bring a scenario and then talk about the actual real life elements at play, and that's not to just say, here's PAVE, here's what it stands for, use it. That's not a scenario, right? to say, here's the flight, here's how we implement it, here's the mitigations we take, here's the actions we take while we're flying to execute those decisions, and then here's the backup plans. Like, that's the sort of thing a CFI should be discussing. It's not actually all that complicated. It just has to be said in very clear language. And if people do that, when it comes to any element, whether you're saying I'm teaching a quick stop, here's the quick stop, here's the maneuver, but here's the things that could happen and go wrong. Here's how we manage those things and mitigate them. And then if we see this is what we do. Like, if you include that stuff, you're in a good position with anything you teach to avoid outcomes. And so I don't know if this came up on my last podcast, but I did write for the USHST a couple of years ago now, but HSE 125 is pre-flight risk assessment and for student flights. So it's not terribly long, but it's a pretty thorough document exactly on this stuff. And anybody who now is going to teach this type of thing and feels like, I didn't get instruction on it, I've now got to teach it, I don't really know where or how to implement these strategies. It was written before the ACS, but I actually was just recently thinking I should go through and see line by line. I'm fairly certain everything's covered in there. It talks very explicitly about how to do scenario-based training, how to use flight risk assessment tools and PAVE. And then it gives you a bunch of options of different ways from very simple to more complex on how you might implement those strategies and how to convince your student or applicant that it's something that, they should value and put time and resources into. So anyway, I encourage anybody to check that out. And I think you'll find it like pretty easy to transfer that stuff into your instruction. And students obviously can check it out too, to see, how they might use those strategies.
Yeah, it sounds like a great resource. I mean, so much of being a CFI, in my opinion, and I'm probably even dumbing this down from what you're actually talking about, but, I always kind of put it in my head is like, I need to know exactly what that student's going to do wrong before a maneuver, and it could necessarily not always be like a safety issue. It could be like damaging the aircraft, right? Like wrapping on the throttle before an auto, which could also lead to other bad negative things, but you're going to have a bad, you're going to overspeed. Quick stops, right? Counting up instead of counting down is something that we did at Hillsborough, and then making sure that a student wasn't, gripped around the throttle and ready to, give themselves a simulated auto rotation, because it's kind of that similar pace, lowering collective during hover autos, all those things. Like, I felt like one way that I escaped, not actually having any issues as a flight instructor, no overspeeds. My one little deal was a stinger strike. I've talked about it on the podcast before, but, I taught fold downs for a long time. I had taught all sorts of different students. And for me, it was just always about knowing like exactly what that student was going to try to do to kill me at that instant or break the machine, and I never allowed myself not to be ready for that. When I'm starting the helicopter, we would hold it in D10. I never relaxed on that. And I actually brought that into my real world flying. I think that sometimes it's easy to relax on certain points. An example that I'll bring up here is like, if you start allowing yourself to be relaxed on certain things, I think that that's the beginning of the Swiss cheese, right? That's like the beginning where things can over time start to lead to a negative outcome. I saw this when I worked at a tour company in the Grand Canyon. Starting the 130 is very easy. I think you might know, you flip a switch and it does it, right? But we were always taught to kind of guard the switch, monitor everything, and we could, turn the switch off if something was not going in a direction that we wanted to go in. I saw a lot of people just flip the switch, put the guard on, and back off, right? As the starting sequence was happening. And like, to me, that's just so unnecessary, right? It's like you're now just, you're just kind of getting lazy. And I think that that's one of the causes of, accidents is that we don't talk about enough, is like this just idea of becoming complacent or even lazy on the little things. And if you allow yourself to kind of get lackluster on the little things, the big things will follow. So again, my soapbox. Sorry, Dave.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. And complacency is really hard that way. I think, self-discipline and professionalism, like, that's what, when I hire people, I have to say, like, I'm paying you to do those things that are, maybe low probability, but high consequence, like you said, right? Low probability, high consequence stuff is still the stuff that you have to pay attention to. Yep. And that's, if it's super low probability and low consequence, then ultimately at an operation, the operation gets to make those choices. So, if you have a different analysis than your company, you have to see if sometimes it's the other way. Sometimes your company thinks something's low consequence and low probability and you're like, this is bad, I'm not going to do it. You
Yeah.
have to make sure, and if that happens enough, you leave the company, right? So risk tolerances are a very personal thing. You want to get a company that shares your risk tolerance to make sure that's good for you and them. But ultimately, when you're kind of, looking at those things, it doesn't have to be a big paper analysis, but the idea is that, if something could go wrong, even if it's low chance, avoid complacency. And another example is obviously just even checklist use and things like that. I think professionalism
100%
is a big factor there. So
it drives me nuts. I fly with a lot of private owners, man, and they're private, and then boom, the checklist just goes out the door. And I'm like, excuse me, like, where's your checklist? I don't have it. Well, I'm not flying with you then. Like,
right.
it happened to me recently, actually. It's just, such a funny thing to me. I always utilize the checklist. And I'm not just saying that. I literally, I believe wholeheartedly that if you start to take, if you start to allow yourself to relax on certain spots, then you're just opening yourself up to long-term issues. And I approach that in not just helicopter flying. I think that's a lot of life, right? Like, you allow yourself to be lazy and not work out, you'll continue not to work out, right? It's just kind of human nature. So we're always fighting the human side, right? And that's, I think, what makes aviation, and specifically helicopter aviation, dangerous, is that we're always battling, this idea. I want to audible a little bit. I was watching Good Morning America this morning while I'm enjoying my morning coffee, and it was about the Alaska Airlines pilot that had a mental breakdown and decided to, maybe try to crash the airplane. I don't really know the full details. I remember it happening. He's speaking out now, and they're talking about, they're bringing national attention to pilots and this idea of mental illness. And, if we're outdated, I know that we didn't pre-talk about this, so
that's fine.
I'm not expecting you to have a big opinion, but has this been something that you've discussed or talked about in the past?
Thank you to our sponsor, Robinson Helicopter Company, the choice for unrivaled safety and reliability, so you can accomplish any mission with confidence. For more than half a century, Robinson has been at the forefront of the helicopter industry. From the R22 to the R66 turbine, Robinson makes helicopters accessible so more people can accomplish more missions. Climb higher. For additional information, visit www.robinsonheli.com.
Yeah, actually, just in the last 6 months, there's been a lot of discussion on that, especially at the USHST, as a major issue. I think it is broader than helicopters, obviously, and maybe that conversation, I don't know where its source was. I think the point is it's timely. Everybody's got an experience where their friend or themselves or somebody else had some sort of challenge, mentally, that they maybe weren't sure how to handle, or they knew somebody who, hit it from the FAA or didn't know what the best thing was to do. And it has outcomes like you're describing. People are seeing the massive safety implications. So, the last I heard on this from the USHST was really that they were looking really ambitious, and I don't know what the long-term outcomes will be, but trying to figure out resources for people, trying to have peers to talk to, kind of have anonymous channels and all sorts of other things. And that's just like on the grassroots level. Of course, regulatory and other things may be going on other levels, but to really try to bring this out of the shadows, as you were saying, to make sure people are recognizing and addressing any issues and knowing what resources are available. So I don't know where it'll all come out. I know that if anybody's interested in this sort of thing, or has a background in mental health or anything else, that's not my background, but the USHST is really looking to try to build something that will support pilots. And why that I think is ambitious is just because it takes people, time, resources. And if that's something that somebody knows or has ideas about, then that discussion is ongoing. But I don't certainly have any answers for it right now. I think, I'm glad the conversation's getting going, and I'm excited to see where it's going to lead.
Yeah, it's wild. It's always been something I've always felt was kind of funny, and funny in like not a great funny, but just a, somewhat weird way of, we're human, right? Like whether you're a pilot or you're not a pilot, we're human. we all deal, I think, with good days and bad days and somewhere in between, right? And also life can happen, right? You could be a happy person and then your spouse dies or gets diagnosed with cancer or something traumatic, right? That can mess you up, right? There's so many factors, and I think as pilots we're always afraid to kind of talk about that. Like, what if you're not a depressed person, but yeah, your spouse gets diagnosed with this horrible disease, or a kid, you know, God forbid, you have a kid that passes away, or something traumatic. You know, what is a pilot supposed to do in that scenario? And I think it's important to talk about because, you know, I think just from this is just a personal opinion, and also some personal experience, is that I think that jobs and professions like pilots, police, EMS, you know, it's high level stuff where you're not necessarily allowed to be a human and have human emotions and things like that. And then I think that leads to toxic behavior when you're not engaging in that profession. You know, I know on the flying side that alcohol and alcoholism and the use of alcohol is fairly high. You know, pilots are known to be a bit of drinkers, right? And again, I don't know what the statistics are. I drank a lot. I don't drink anymore. I don't know if I drank a lot because the stressfulness of the job. I don't know. You know, I'm sure it's a factor. And so I think it's interesting. You know, it's interesting how this will play out. And I don't know the answer either, Dave, but I'm glad we're talking about it. And in that particular situation, I think that guy maybe took some shrooms leading up to that, which I think is ridiculous. You shouldn't be taking mind altering drugs if you're a commercial pilot flying in a few days. I mean, to me, that's where some credibility is lost, honestly, in that whole story. And whether he's taking the psychedelics because whatever, it just like seems weird to me. So anyway, that's a little bit of a detour from kind of what we were on path to talk about. But I find it curious, and I think the conversation should continue to happen.
Yeah, I think to your point, like it's not well delineated between major disqualifying mental issues and small or maybe manageable things, so there's no way to navigate that. And as somebody who's I had employees that suffered from different challenges, and there was a lot of question we brought on it. We had to talk with legal and bring on attorneys or discuss all the things and try to figure out how to navigate it, because there's really not a lot of known information on what's okay, what's not okay, and what the same for the guy who was suffering with the issues he had. It was a challenge for him to navigate as well. So, you know, we would have liked to say, hey, here's the right steps. But a lot of things, ultimately, obviously we were able to do it. But it wasn't easy. I'm glad that there's going to be more coming.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things. I mean, I think mental health has become a forefront conversation, and I think sometimes it goes a little too extreme. I think we're becoming a little too soft in some areas, but I think it's appropriate to talk about mental health. And I think that as pilots, it's a stressful world. It's a stressful job. Flying air medical, a lot of guys and gals, friends of mine, you know, I saw some weird things in air medical, right? And I don't think that they really affect me. I don't really think about it, but I mean, I've had a leg in a bag right next to me in a 407, a leg, not attached, right? Like it's a weird concept. I didn't see the leg, right? Like, but it was right there. That's a weird thing. You know, it's like you get in, you know, that's a weird thing about air medical. It's like you get into flying because you love flying. And then before you know it, you're now flying with these people that are really sick or lots of blood and weird things. So yeah, interesting to see how it plays out. And I appreciate the detour a little bit. Speaking of mental health and approaching things, I do want to talk about safety, but real fast, just since I have you on, and I know a lot of my listeners are either about to take a check ride or will be taking a check ride in the future, or maybe they're about to take their first check ride. You know, I remember that first check ride like yesterday. Specifically, I remember the days leading up to it. I was poo-pooing my pants. I was so scared. I was so nervous. I came in, passed. Luckily, I've never failed a check ride, knock on wood. But you now as a DPE on the other side, Well, what would be your encouragement to applicants that maybe have kind of a high anxiety when it comes to taking check rides?
Well, I think one of the best things anybody can do prior to their test is like as many mock tests as possible, really. And what I think is one of the best mitigations for not passing is, you covered all the material. Okay, checked all the boxes. Maybe my instructor did, but what I'd like to see more of in general is just that's plan to reach that point 2/3 the way before you get to in terms of time before your test, and then spend the rest of the time doing like as many as it takes that you do 2 full tests at least, where they're like, and obviously we're not looking for flawless, but strong executions. And we're talking about ground, flight, and all of it, and run through the whole thing. Now, the best way to do that is with another pilot. Some people are at flight schools that are so small or limited in resources, you can't jump in with somebody else. I honestly think that puts you at a little bit of I don't want to say it puts you at disadvantage. I just mean like you should do whatever you can to bounce it off somebody else. Get on a group or a forum, or get with a peer, or whatever you can do. Talk to your spouse or partner or friend and just like bounce these questions, have them quiz you. Just get used to saying it out loud. Ultimately, the good thing is if you're career oriented, you're going to do check rides for a long time, and they get so much easier with practice. Every one you do gets a little bit less stressful. And my advice on that side is that the reason they become less stressful is you stop doing the test for the examiner and you start doing it for you. You're like, this is what I do. Thanks for watching. Give me some feedback. And if you are strong in what you do, then it's not an issue, and they'll recognize that and they'll give you strong feedback. But ultimately, you may make mistakes. Everybody recognizes that. But once you start doing the test because you know that you are meeting the standard, then it becomes much less stressful. So the best thing you could do is be very comfortable with the standards and know that you've checked the boxes, but then practice demonstrating that you meet the standard, because the demonstration part in the stressful environment could be really hard. And the more practice you have in the demonstration side, then you've covered both things, not just having the knowledge, but be able to communicate it and being able to show it when you fly. So I hope that's useful.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, it's all about being prepared, knowing things inside and out. I think it goes back to this idea, like you said earlier, of professionalism, right? Like, if you want to be a professional pilot, well, that takes being a professional, and that means knowing your stuff, not just knowing it to know it, but really knowing it and asking questions when you don't know it. It still never helped me, especially in my private commercial CFI. Those check rides specifically were always, real nerve wracking for me. But yeah, you're right. As I've done 135 check rides and subsequent, it does get easier. The test remains the same. You're still getting quizzed, and you don't know everything all the time, but you're competent and comfortable in your skills of being a good pilot, being a good decision maker.
And I still study a lot.
You have
I
to
study a lot. I have all sorts of resources that I've typed up and made for myself, and I continue to review those all the time for checks and between checks just for myself. So the point is, I recognize that's not a thing, but or not making it that much easier. Just consider that check rides. Try not to see them as the check ride. Try to see it as like a way to demonstrate what you do and how you do it. I remember one of the biggest issues I had was when in my training, there was a question or something asked, and I was racking my brain. Does he want to see this? Does he want to see this? What did this examiner want to see? What did this examiner want to see? And it's just, unfortunately, it's natural, I think, but and for myself to realize in the long term, it's way the wrong way to go about it. And, if you fail because your CFI, did totally drop the ball on something, that's unfortunate, and it's kind of out of your hands. But at least try to use the standards. That's where sometimes people are strong in things that aren't even part of the PTS, but they miss huge gaps in the PTS. And you're like, well, just, use that document, and now ACS, use the document to make sure you've covered your bases, and you can take some ownership of that. And that way you're not leaning as heavily on your CFI as well, in case they do miss something. But it is something that as an examiner, just know that, we're sticking, if your examiner should be sticking to the standard. So it should remove some of the, ifs and buts. And if something looks different, but it's within the standard, different from what I think is perfect, then that's not a pass fail issue. That should be true across the board.
And I think one of the things that you said there is I think we talked about this last time, or maybe I've just complained about it before on the podcast, but if you're a CFI, please help encourage your student, specifically private all the way through, to now review the ACS. I did not know that what the PTS was until right before my CFI check ride, Dave. Honest to God truth. I knew of it, but I really didn't know how to operate it. I didn't know how to maneuver it. I never used it for a check ride, ever. Never looked at it before a private check ride, a commercial, never. Because I didn't understand how to maneuver it. And I don't think my CFI knew either because they weren't taught. And so I even remember when I went into teaching CFI training, I'm like, I don't know how to do this thing. I had to go back and then figure out, hey, this is actually really important. And why is this a gap in training? So if you're a CFI, you're listening.
It's probably underutilized. It's kind of funny because it is the cheat sheet. Everybody's like, oh, what's the cheat sheet? And I'm like, I do what's in that book. I mean,
it's the test.
It's very as clear as it could be.
It's funny.
And it's my job relies on it. If I test on something that's not in that book and I fail somebody for it, then that's on me.
There goes your authority.
And vice versa. If I don't cover something that's required in the book, I could lose my DP authorization. So that should be true across the board. Yeah.
Transitioning back to safety, I know that you're on the safety team. What are some of the other things that are coming and happening right now? I know that you had mentioned in text that SMS is now required for Part 91 tour operations. What are some other things talk about that? What do you got?
This podcast is brought to you by HeliCASTS. Tired of listings that go nowhere? Exhausted by tire kickers who waste your time? Don't sell your helicopter alone. HeliCASTS handles the entire process from start to finish. So, if your helicopter is sat too long waiting for a buyer, contact the team at HeliCASTS today for your complimentary market valuation. Call 1-855-HeliCASTS, 1-855-735-5226, or email sales@helicopter.com. HeliCASTS. List it, sell it, done.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a big deal. And so I guess we probably don't have time for much more than that, but I think it's worth discussing. I don't know how much, all your listeners, it depends on where they are and what they do, how much familiarity they would have with safety management systems. But the big thing is that they've been required for all airlines since 2018. The NTSB recommended a long time ago, or I guess sometime thereafter, to say, hey, we should spread this out to the Part 135 operators. And that's not just helicopter specific. And then they finally basically published the final rule, went into effect in April of this year, 2024, that SMS is required for all 135 operators and for 91, 147 tour operators. And they have to demonstrate the letter. That's one of the things I have in here. They have to have a declaration of compliance. So that will be by May 28th, 2027. So you have less than 3 years to get it, to have it. Basically, you submit that. You say, we have complied in these ways. And then, the surveillance or the FAA will show up and look at that over time and see how you're complying. You have to be prepared to show that you're compliant. But ultimately, for those who aren't familiar with SMS, it's really got 4 major things. And what I like to think about SMS, like if you're a pilot who doesn't involve, of course, you always have a role in SMS in an operation, no matter where you are in a company. If there's an SMS, you should be familiar with it. That's part of the thing. But ultimately, it may not be part of your day-to-day to manage it, but I think it has great implications for how you do operate as a pilot. It doesn't have to be organizational. The concepts apply at all levels. But ultimately, there's safety policy, which really, if you've ever heard like the top-down versus bottom-up safety debate, it says like, oh, does the manager have to care about safety, or is it just like the front line who's really doing the work? And ultimately, the SMS finalizes that to say, hey, we have to have the priorities, resources, money, everything else at the top in line, or it doesn't matter what the guys at the bottom say, I want to be safe. And if they don't have the resources, money, and priorities, then it's impossible for you to execute those actions. So the policy says, hey, at the top, everybody agrees this is a priority, and we're going to direct resources in a way that backs it up. And then for personal, if you're a pilot, like your policy, if you want to have safe operations, might be personal minimums or just your normal like habits. The point is like, you should have an idea of how you like to operate. And I write them down, like safety or personal minimums are a good way for you as the smallest possible level to be having your own safety policy. Then there's safety risk management, which for those who aren't familiar, SMS has a big part of it is a reporting system, which is usually anonymous, but it says that the company or operation is going to try to identify hazards so that before they become accidents or issues, and then try to put mitigations or risk controls or steps in place to prevent it from breaking the accident chain, if you will. And so that includes things like FRATs or flight risk assessment tools, or it could be all sorts of operational procedures that are in place to manage risk. And ultimately for yourself, like it could be a FRAT or pre-flight procedure or just your process as a pilot and how you do things. And for me personally, I do write down all my lessons learned I work for myself, basically. I have corporate clients that take a big part of what I do, and that's a big deal. But ultimately, the flight department is me. And so I have to, if somebody's going to keep an eye to make sure I don't repeat a mistake, then I'm going to have to write down something that went wrong so I can go back and review those things and not forget and do it again. So I encourage that.
I think that's great, Dave. That and again, like I said at the beginning, like you are a prime example of a very professional pilot, someone that's really committed to safety and doing your part. One of the things with SMS, in my opinion, and what I've seen as there's been more kind of forced implementation. It's a really hard word for me to say, I guess. Is I was fortunate. I worked for Hillsborough. I thought Hillsborough had a great SMS. They were early adapters, and I thought it was a really good, highly utilized SMS. Worked for Air Evac. I thought they had a really good SMS. Something that they believed in, something that they taught and were passionate about. I've worked for other operators where it kind of seemed like the SMS was just a box to check. In fact, I think some of the SMS tools that were used were kind of like this plug and play software, and the culture of the entire SMS just wasn't there. And so if you're listening to this podcast and if you're just a pilot at an operation, I was talking to a friend recently, and he called because there's an issue, and he didn't report something because another pilot said, well, like, yeah, there's an SMS, and I guess you can report it if you want, but that stuff happens all the time. That was like what was kind of relayed to him, right? And sure enough, he decides 3 days after this incident, he's going to report it. Reports it. And, long story short, he gets in trouble, reprimanded. I don't actually know what happened. I didn't hear the end story. But I asked him, I said, well, what did you guys talk about with SMS during your training? Nothing. That there was one. That's what they talked about. There is an SMS. Okay, what else? Nothing. We didn't talk about anything else. So to me, like, that's an operational issue right there, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I get worried about.
You're totally right. The box or the book on the shelf thing, and that will go away with the FAA's implementation. Unfortunately, it'll probably mean there are more books on the shelf.
I think so.
But hopefully through the process, obviously there's some outcomes that are positive. But that's why I put this emphasis on the personal SMS. You can't rely on your company's SMS to keep you out of trouble, right? Ultimately, a company that has a good SMS is obviously a great asset to you and should help keep your operations safer. But you're the guy who's like we said, at the front line, you have to implement your own strategies, and you're going to move, just like Halsey said, you're going to move from company to company. So you're not required to have an SMS, but I think it's a good idea if every other operator is, and you're the one who's ultimately responsible. So doing things like, writing down personal minimums, professional, that's the other element. Safety assurance is checking back and reviewing lessons learned, seeing if there are gaps. Like, did I make mistakes? Have I had repetitive issues? Like, I know my trends. I have things that I tend to do wrong. And there's things that I do really well. Those are good things to be familiar with about yourself, just like an operator could be familiar. And then there's safety promotion, which is like, what's my professional development? Do I go learn new things? Do I listen to podcasts? Like, do I read? How do I make sure that I improve my abilities and knowledge? And the point is, like, for an operation, they have to do the same thing. If you don't put those things in place, then when you go between operators that do or don't have an SMS and their safety culture changes, ultimately you might be at more risk. And if you're at one company that's really strong, that's awesome. But just keep in mind, ultimately it's good to have your own strategies. So yeah, I think the implementation of the rule will be interesting to see what the long-term changes are. along the lines of that, while I'm a huge, obviously, supporter of SMS, the data on the implementation of SMS over the history of it since 2018, when it was regulatory required, is debatable. Like, we don't have enough data to show factually that it has greatly improved accidents because of it. And that's a really hard thing over years before they can really say that. But everybody knows on the whole, it's a positive change, but it's actually a kind of an interesting debate.
That is funny. I mean, I'm going to be on the side of the debate where I've just been such part of such strong SMS at two different companies specifically. There's no doubt to me that things were prevented. And I think it's one of those things where, I guess, well, obviously accidents will be decreased hopefully over time of the implement, but again, you have to have really good SMS. I think that we're going to have some operators that really bleed SMS, and love it and embrace it. And then we're going to have people that don't. So I think the data is always going to be a little bit skewed. I think another thing that you can do as a pilot, whether you're a student pilot or you're a pilot applying for jobs and interviewing, I talked about this in a solo podcast recently. Like, when you go and you're picking out your flight school, it's your opportunity to ask certain questions. And something I encourage you to ask is, hey, tell me about your safety culture, and specifically tell me about the SMS program. How do you guys implement SMS? What is your stance on SMS and safety culture and just culture? Talk to me about that, right? It's your opportunity to kind of interview that flight school, right? I would personally go to a school that has very strong SMS, so I could build that foundation as a pilot, because I think then you can bring that into the industry. And if you're now going into the industry and you're flying commercial, utility, air medical, offshore, whatever it is, during your interview, ask about that. Hey, tell me about your SMS. What is the safety culture here? I think done are the days where you should just accept every job because you need the hours. Like, if you go and you talk to a company and it's like, yeah, we have an SMS. It's, there's the binder right there on the shelf. Maybe don't work for that company, right? Maybe that's how we start turning the industry into actually adopting the mindset, because I think it's the mindset that's huge. And kudos, big shout out to Hillsborough. I think I got a good SMS foundation because they didn't just check a box, and they were early adapters to it. I felt like they really lived it. So anyway, that's my thought.
Yeah, it's all really good advice. And I think you're right that when you choose your jobs, it's definitely something that should be explored. And ultimately, 91-147 tour operators, that's like a big thing for a lot of these operators to have to implement them. But keep in mind, flight schools, a lot of these companies will still not be just 91 operators that don't do tours. A lot of these companies won't be required to have SMS, but that doesn't stop anybody from doing it. It's getting to be pretty well known. It doesn't cost it much to do it right. You could do it all on a spreadsheet with very little resources and Google Forms, and do a great job. So
it's in developing that culture.
I'll plug one more thing here. The HAI, or now BAI, has a great resource called Framework for Safety. So anybody who's out there who wants to understand an SMS from like the lowest possible, simplest strategies up to full development, where like the whole journey from no safety to safety, the Framework for Safety is a manual for making that transition. And any operator that is out there trying to make that transition, it's a really great step-by-step tool, and a lot of time and resources went into it. So I encourage anybody to check it out. And you can make yourself an asset for your company, other companies, when you know that stuff. It's a big deal right now. There are many companies trying to put this stuff in place, and they're all scrambling to figure out how to do it. So people who know are valuable.
Awesome. Dave, thank you for that. Dave, thanks for coming on again. And I just love talking about this stuff. To me, my podcast is a cool podcast. I get to have a lot of cool conversations with neat people and talking about their path and their career. But I think one area where I don't touch enough is just kind of talking about things like this, talking about safety, talking about regulations, having these deep dives. And I think you're just so invaluable resource of knowledge and someone that's really committed to it. So let's commit to each other that we will continue to do this. Love to have you we're 3 episodes away then, Dave, for having you be a 5-episode jacket guy.
I'm
So
keep looking for that velvet robe.
I will get you a jacket. I will.
Jacket, nice.
So thank you for coming on. There's just so much to talk about, but we've hit our time for today. So we'll just have to leave it where we're at. But I think that was a great conversation.
Great.
To our
I enjoyed it. Yeah,
listeners,
thanks for having me.
yeah, of course, dude. It's always great. Dave and I go way back. We've been longtime friends. One of the beautiful parts of this industry is just the friendships, the connections. You know, I've had good times with Dave. I've listened to funk music in bars in Portland with Dave. I've gallivanted around HAI, now VAI with Dave. And some of that I've just connected with over the years and enjoy. And there's so many Daves in my life because of helicopters, which is cool. So Dave, I'm just grateful for your friendship and grateful for what you're doing in the industry and proud of you, man. You're doing some really cool things and you're kind of setting your own path. To our listeners, Dave, where can they go and learn more about safety on the VAI side and the safety team side?
I think I would love to put a bunch of the links to some of these items, in the show notes. So let's plan to do that. The VAI website, if you go to safety, there's a ton of stuff on there. I mean, it's one of the core principles of VAI to now just put it out there. It doesn't matter if you're a member or not, you can access it. USHST has a bunch of great stuff as well, of course. And I think we should link that one specific item we talked about in the notes as well. I don't have any specific URLs, to type out for you here, but both those places are really good places to go where a lot is being funneled. So yep, definitely check out both those resources.
So many resources to be safe nowadays. And safety at times can be cliche, but we all have a commitment. So I encourage you to be a professional pilot, continue to sharpen your knife and become a better pilot. To our listeners, thank you for listening. To our sponsors, big shout out to y'all. Couldn't do it without you guys. And of course, to MHM Publishing and the entire Vertical HeliCASTS platform. We love you. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks.
Thank you to our sponsor, Robinson Helicopter Company, the choice for unrivaled safety and reliability so you can accomplish any mission with confidence. For more than half a century, Robinson has been at the forefront of the helicopter industry. From the R22 to the R66 turbine, Robinson makes helicopters accessible so more people can accomplish more missions. Climb higher. For additional information, visit www.robinsonheli.com.
Thank you to our sponsor, Vertical Aviation International. Are you ready for the largest vertical aviation show in the world? Verticon, formerly HAI Heli Expo, is coming to Dallas in March. With over 15,000 professionals and 600 companies in attendance, this is an event you don't want to miss. If you're interested in exhibiting, contact sales at verticalavi.org. That's sales at verticalavi.org. See you at Verticon.
This podcast is brought to you by SafeRotors. Tired of listings that go nowhere? Exhausted by tire kickers who waste your time? Don't sell your helicopter alone. SafeRotors handles the entire process from start to finish. So, if your helicopter is sat too long waiting for a buyer, contact the team at SafeRotors today for your complimentary market valuation. Call 1-855-SELICOPTER, 1-855-735-5226, or email sales@selicopter.com. SafeRotors. List it, sell it, done.